So, okay, welcome. My name is Betsy Cunningham, and I'm one of the volunteers for Kevin Bell's campaign. And just kind of the introduction is this is one of four town halls that Kevin has done over the campaign regarding issues in House District 2, and the focus really kind of around what can be done from a state house legislative issue. You know, what somebody elected to the state legislature could do about issues. And so this one was suggested by Dane Zahner about diversity. And so he's going to be the facilitator, and I'm primarily the person who's going to just do the technology. And if people have questions, anybody who might have a question or comment, they can either raise their hand or just ask the question, unmute themselves, and or they can put it in the chat and it can be relayed. So, all right, Dane, I will turn over to you so you can introduce yourself and the other guests.
Awesome. My name's Dane Zahner, and I go by he, him, and his pronouns, and I'm a Douglas County resident, and kind of helping Kevin a little bit too. But this was just something that was close to my heart. Is we were asked to try to bring some different programs to our county and raise awareness on different things. And, you know, to me, the BIPOC and LGBTQ and diversity in Douglas County is something that is dear to my heart. And so I reached out to some of you and thought you could bring a really good perspective to the table, but Juliana and then Lank and Brett, and I just think you can all speak to what is going on in our county, what it's like to be an individual that identifies within that spectrum, and also at the same time, you know, kind of the good and what are our opportunities as, you know, leaders of our state need to know from us on how to change the perspective of our community to be a better community. I know today, you know, just an incident around LGBTQ plus in Eugene, it raised awareness of the need of how to educate our community on so many different angles around that perspective. There was a drag show. It's a story time. It's all about kids, reading stories to kids, and it raised so much negativity out there. And I just think, you know, that's one of the things that we have to counterbalance. And it seems like situations like this are escalating all the time to be worse and worse and worse. And where, you know, like today, the police, there was, you know, diversity, or I mean, animosity on both sides and both angles. And it's just challenging to see that. And I think that's one of the things, Kevin, that we need to, but I wanted to introduce Brett, Juliana, and Lank. And if Brett, if you want to go in, introduce yourself, a little bit about yourself, and then Juliana and Lank, that would be great to just kind of give a understanding to the community what role you play and what Douglas County is all about. Brett, you're still muted.
Thanks for that, Dane. I don't typically mute when I'm on a situation like this, but I did because of pet noise. I'm Brett Cecil, and I'm the Democratic nominee for House District 1. I live in Curry County, but my district encompasses all of Curry County and part of the southern part of Coos County and some of western Douglas County. So I'm getting to know Douglas County a little bit better. I am an LGBTQ nominee. So I'm a gay man living in rural America, rural Oregon, and getting to know some of my friends and neighbors, especially here in Port Orford, where I live in Curry County. During the time that I've been running my campaign, I've actually been approached, I find it really heartening, by young teenage kids, you know, that want to let me know who they are and what they're about. But most of them have been coming to me with their concerns and fears about being harmed and having to protect themselves just out in the community, which at this point in time to me seems crazy that we're still having to do this, but we are. And I've recently had a parent reach out to me over the weekend whose son is in junior high school in one of our local junior highs, obviously, and had a premeditated activity, physical altercation against him by some of the other kids at school, and is now being written up by the police for harassment. Apparently both the kids are, when what I saw in the video didn't look like the gay boy was doing anything out of the ordinary. He was jumped by other kids in the school. I'm just trying to figure out ways to get these issues out in the public without creating more backlash for the kids that are in the situation. That's my real concern right now. But I think we really need to look at where that fear leaves our kids and trying to be well educated and become productive citizens in our society. So those are concerns that I'm looking at in my campaign, and something that I wanted to talk about here today, and maybe get some other people's ideas of how we can approach that from the state legislature level. And like I said, being careful not to stir up more trouble, and at the same time resolve some of these issues. I think kids should be safe. And again, we hear a lot about safety in schools, and everyone thinks about firearms at school. But I also, over the weekend, had this questioning from someone in my own party here in Curry County, asking, what my ideas are about safe schools. And I try to be really clear that it's not just about firearms for me, that this idea that kids are safe to go to school and not be harassed by other kids is part of school safety that we need to look at as well. So I'm going to leave you with that, and hopefully we can have some more discussion around these ideas and what we can do from the legislative level to help smooth this out and make life easier for everybody. Dane?
Thanks, Brett. Juliana.
Yeah, yes, I'm Juliana Merez. I worked for 27 years at Roseburg Public Schools as the Indian Education Coordinator, as the McKinney-Vento Homeless and Runaway Coordinator, and also as the point of contact for child welfare and Indian child welfare. I retired from that job, and I'm now the Cultural Director for Peace at Home. I'm not representing Peace at Home, but I do happen to work there. My connection with Dane is that when I first began my job, I was very lucky to know Billy Russo and the Harm Reduction Center, and people like Dane, people like Link also did street outreach, and we did programs like the Tattoo Expo and different opportunities to spread knowledge in our community and talk about safety, talk about issues that are kind of hard to talk about with the public. And I was very fortunate, both of you and people that have done your job in the past through the Harm Reduction Center, HIV Alliance, it was called at one time. You guys, the integrity that you work with, and the kindness, the goodness, the honesty, the ability to work with a diverse population, really, it's an honor to work with you. Now with domestic violence, I see people of all walks of life escaping that situation. As cultural director, I find that many people in our county have not experienced a lot of cultural diversity. And so I try to give the opportunity for our clients to share that, to share their personal truths, and to talk about personal safety and what that means. As a descendant of the Osage Nation, I'm American Indian and white. And for many people of, I can't speak for every tribal person, but I will say that there is a certain uncertainty, there is a certain safety concern, particularly for women, but of all people of tribal tradition. So oftentimes that's a deep concern. We've had a long history of historic trauma. So I think it's very important that people be educated on that, and that all people feel safe. Thank you, Dane.
Thank you. Link.
Uh, sorry, Link Rodriguez. I had it in, but that's the reason I had the screen. Because I'm right now on medical hiatus from the HIV Alliance. I here for Douglas County did a lot of a lot of our services are very collaborative and very and so working with unsheltered people, disadvantaged people, marginalized communities, LGBTQ, BIPOC, people who are at this time having mental health issues. A lot of all the states for mental health were at the bottom, even below the HIV Alliance. I know that mental health is a huge issue for
Dane, if I may,
Oregonians.
Link,
We're
this is
double
Brett. I'm sorry that
hepatitis
I'm going to
C.
interrupt you here if I
We've
can,
got those.
Link.
That's a huge face. That's the board. It doesn't matter your color.
Yeah, Link, I was gonna
Mhm.
see if turning off your video, your sound's kind of coming in and out.
Can you
I
all
was
still hear me?
wondering if maybe turn it off your. We can hear you now, but I was wondering if maybe if you wanted to switch off your video, it might work better. Try that now.
We'd love to see your face, but I'd rather hear what you have to say.
Okay. Going out.
That's better.
Okay. So yeah, I was talking about mental health in Oregon. I think that's a huge issue that we have right now. A lot of intersectionality. It goes into whether you're BIPOC, LGBTQ, unsheltered, near unsheltered. It's a huge effect with the mental health. Brett, you were talking about making a safe place for the LGBTQ teens. Thought is on that is to ensure that there's zero tolerance policies within the school systems, but also maybe make it part of curriculum, like for their health classes or social whatever classes they have about instituting anti-bullying curriculum. I wouldn't say put them on the spots, but put it out there about bullying and some of the social ramifications that bullying, talk about suicide rates, mental health as well. 90% of people who commit suicide also have a mental health component. So to talk about the mental health issues that surround bullying and the LGBTQ teens, LGBTQ teens have a higher suicide rate, and to let them know that it's not okay and that these need to be safe spaces. So when we were talking about that, I was like, oh, definitely, buckle down and say you need to have zero tolerance and more education to build a culture of sensitivity and awareness and safety for these kids. But with PrEP, I did a lot of focused outreach with the communities who were definitely affected by this, people who are in LGBT communities. Over 6% of the people with HIV are gay men. Also intravenous drug users, people who engage in unsafe practices. So I'm definitely looking forward to going back to the agency and working, and I love working grassroots. I love working frontline. I love doing outreach. Juliana's worked with me, Dane's worked with me. And my heart is definitely, after only a short period of time, changed me as a human being, and I was so happy and privileged to get to work with these people. And I'm happy to be here tonight. Dane?
Hey, thank you, Link. No, and I was gonna, my story, I've been down in Douglas County for about 20 years as a, openly gay man. And I know my journey personally is a lot different than the dynamics a lot of people face. I think my position at Kmart, I worked with as a Kmart store manager for 25 years, and it put me at a different level where, everybody kind of, actually, when I moved to the store, I wasn't fully out to the world yet. And my predecessor, the store manager, outed me to the entire store prior to my arrival, which I was like, this is awesome. I get to be who I am. Because I had always kind of hid myself at work. If somebody asked, I was very upfront and I was open and honest. But that helped open a door for me where I could just be who I am. And, that was a change. But so the community also knew I was openly gay. The customers, the police department, we did was shop with a cop. Pretty much everybody I interact with understood and knew that. And so I know that, my experience was a lot different than I know the dynamics of the LGBTQ community does not feel that, especially our youth, Brett. I think you touched on, and I think those are the things we really do need to work on. We need better diversity training in schools. We need to, not only do they need sex education, but they need diversity education. They need to understand, that not everybody, Douglas County, if you pull up dynamics of population ratios, we're a heavily white community, which is a lot of what rural America is. And that is not what they're going to encounter when they go out into the world. And it also causes a lot of confusion and frustration. And I think Blink touched on suicide in the youth. The LGBTQ plus and BIPOC populations, they, and I don't really like using the word BIPOC, but people that are not identified as white have a challenging time in our community, and we need to understand that our youth, especially the trans youth, face a huge amount of barriers out there that a regular individual that identifies as white does not face. And it's like, I think those are the things we need to be very upfront about. Indigenous, Black, people of color, Hispanic, those populations in our community all face challenges that we don't necessarily face. And, I think those are an education that fully educates every student on the different dynamics of not only race, ethnicity, and also, sexual identity and what it is all about. I think it would be a better education tool for our youth. And that's one of the things they're not getting, and I think that's where we need to change. How do we bring HIV education, Hep C education into the schools for HIV Alliance, where I work now. But, I think we could do so much of a better job. That seems to be what the administrative staff, a lot of the teaching staff, they're asking for that. But there's that challenge of bringing that. So even harm reduction is, in a sense, is needed so much right now, because we're seeing so much of a new population, inject drugs. And those are things that, and I know Juliana just put something in the chat, but that's kind of what I see. I have to be very empathetic and understanding that my world and who I am as a white gay male is not necessarily how others encounter this world and this community that we live in. So, I'm very respectful of that, and when I'm out there. So that's kind of my 2 cents. I love this county. I enjoy living here, but I also identify that there's a lot of challenges that we have not faced as a community that we really need to be better at facing. And I think, what we're talking about tonight, the diversity of our community, is so important. And Juliana, did you want to touch on what you put in the chat?
Yes. Yeah. What I wrote about was it was very stark to me. An evening when I got a message from the emergency room and then from the hospital, one of my students had been beaten severely. simply because he was gay. Some other kids took it upon themselves to beat him, to hospitalize him, simply because they found out he was gay. And he was a kid I'd worked with for many years. He was a kid that kind of pulled himself up by his own bootstraps. And just a lovely person. And to see him like that, broken and bruised, but his spirit was still strong. And he's come back from that. And he's a strong advocate. I'm really proud of him. But to be beaten just because of the way you were born just seems so wrong, so wrong. And, it really made me think about what was in those youth's minds that justified their actions. It's a hard thing for me to understand, but I know it happens and I saw it.
I think Link honestly hit it on the head. I graduated Clyde High School in 2019. In 2018, when I was a sophomore, we just had a brother and a sister move in from LA, went by Xander, and his sister's name was Rebecca. We were all standing in the lunch line when out of nowhere, a man I know goes and calls him the N-word, just like it was plain day. And so it goes to show that even in places that aren't populated, like Roseburg High School, South Douglas, or things like that, our graduating class only had about 31. Even in those small communities, hatred could be found.
Yeah.
And so I usually ask the questions here. And so I also usually like to start off with a magic wand wish. If I could I had my little magic wand and I went to every single one of you, what would you have me do? But I also understand that this issue is a lot more than just a wish. It's a lot of different competing factors that, like Brett was saying right now, that we don't even know what we want to wish for. I don't know how I can specifically help the youth that I grew up with right now. Me being not a normal heterosexual here in Douglas County here, graduating was something that came up. So I'm gonna try my best and I'm gonna go down the list, but starting with Dane, if I had my wand here, what would you see me and what would you say me and Brett at the state legislature do?
I really think it's like, I touched on the education, Lane touched on the education, but how do we change our world to be where everybody's a human and that we don't have to fall, even when I'm testing somebody and I'm asking their race, it's just like, why am I asking this question and putting somebody in a box? And really, why does somebody have to identify as, trans, male to female, female to male, gay, bi? I think our world by using those terms, we're boxing somebody and we're putting person in a box. It's like, why can't we all be human? And I really think the focus of our education as a whole needs to be, how do we ingrain that we're all humans? We come in a lot of different shapes, sizes, colors, identities, and it doesn't matter. So I think a focused, and that's a big project, because how do you focus on education to our youth to understand, like what you just talked about, Kevin, is that, the N-word, why is it even a word that's used anymore to identify somebody? And how do we break that out through our education and just being very upfront, that we're all humans and starting at that point? And that would be my wish, is like, how do we finally come and instill in our country that, in our state, in our county that we live, that our color doesn't matter, how we identify does not matter. It's just that we're all human, and that would be the biggest thing, and how to educate our youth so that the next generation, we don't encounter these same things that continue to just spiral, and it seems we've gotten on this upward swing where it's worse right now, and I mean, racism is just huge right now. It's just like everywhere, and it's scary. And I think that's what we really need to just come to a stopping point. And it starts with our youth and how to educate our youth in a proper way that we're all humans.
maybe we should all have a Julian at each school, a diversity teacher, you know, getting them that teaches them where they come from and what they can do. Brett, what would you like to see in Curry and House District 2 when we're in the legislature together, buddy?
Well, Dane touched on a couple of things that I had already written down before he even spoke. And one of them is putting our privilege to good use. I come from a Caucasian background, a typically religious family. So no one ever even really had much suspicion about who I was on the inside. And I think not being able to feel safe that I could be open and out as to who I was. I was talking about this with one of my friends today. But I feel like that really held me back in my life, that I could have done some very different things that looking back would have been nice to do, like go to college. But I came from a family that wasn't terribly well educated beyond high school. And I kind of felt like not feeling safe at school or being fearful of, keeping in mind I came out in the 80s, so it still wasn't real cool. And I didn't come out until after I was out of high school. But there was always that concern that someone would find out I'd be ostracized in some way. So I didn't participate in a lot of the activities in my high school. Specifically, I didn't go to prom because I personally didn't really have that much interest. I went to somebody else's junior prom when I was a senior. I didn't participate in the college counselors coming and talking to us about going to their schools. I didn't have any of that process because I tended to just stay away from activities at school, so it was not to be harassed and harangued. So I think in the long run, that can really affect a student or a person's long-term outlook on life. I would love to have been a veterinarian, but I didn't know how to make that happen. And I didn't get involved at the high school level to figure out how to do it. So I think productivity and capability for people is really stunted when we're constantly having to worry about who's going to think what about us. So that's something I think we could use our privilege where we are to bring that forward and to help to quell some of this hatred that we see out in the world. The other thing, and this is how Dane and I really met, is around harm reduction. And I think that harm reduction stretches way across the spectrum. It's not just about drugs and alcohol. I think harm reduction can happen on all sorts of levels. And it's a great way. I like to use it with my Republican friends because they're always worried about the economy and talking about money. So if you want to look at it from an economic standpoint, it actually is a great way for us to spend less money on people's healthcare, on people's just everyday lives. If we can reduce the harm that we go through on a daily basis, we can be much more productive people. I know if somebody who lives out on the street has, let's just say they've fallen, knocked their head on the ground, and the EMTs pick them up and take them to the hospital, they're probably not insured. Well, now that might be different in Oregon, because we do have OHP, and we have Medicaid. I'm not in California with Medi-Cal any longer, with Medicaid. So there is some way for hospitals to be paid. If we can reduce that harm of someone having to use those really expensive services, that's quite a benefit for us economically. So it's something to look at. And I think those two things, utilizing the privilege that we have and using a harm reduction model, not just on the drugs and alcohol side, but to use that across the board, even in education, I think may be a way that we can make some great inroads and accomplishments without having to spend a lot of money in the long run. Kevin?
Juliana, I'm really interested to hear what you have to say on this. What's your wish?
Well, I think the education piece is really critical. I ran into an old friend the other day. Her name's Lois Inman. She and I and Al Springer used to do a weekend workshop for kids that really helped team build. And it was a very diverse group of kids. And there's a series of very difficult tasks the kids had to learn to. The only way they could win the games is to work together. They learned they all taste like chicken, right? So and like I said, the only way they could win is to work together. And what they found out was they had more in common than they did differently. If we could find a way to do that, to find our bridges, find our similarities. I think what really bonded me with Link and Dane and Billy and some of our advocates from the LGBTQ community was doing the street outreach. They had my back and I had theirs. We had to work together in order to survive, going out into the homeless camps, going out to various places, working with people that suffered from mental health or addictions. We had to work together and understand each other and trust each other. And I think that really makes a difference. I'm not sure at the legislative level exactly how that could happen. I know housing's a huge issue. You know, I know that there it's very competitive, and making fair housing more available. I think harm reduction is huge. I'm very fearful with Halloween coming up, with the amount of fentanyl out on the street right now. I've lost 3 students so far to that. That's a horrible way for a child to die. It's a horrible way for anyone to die. And you know, addressing that, um, addressing some of the fear issues. I think a lot of times myths and stories and untruths get spread a lot faster than truth. And I think once people get to know each other, human being to human being, a lot of those myths are called out for what they are, the lies that they are. If we are divided, we're easy to conquer. And we need that togetherness. We're all in this together, and we need to recognize that. Like I said, I so enjoyed working with them and finding answers, addressing people with dignity. I love the way we're able to do that. And so I don't know if there could be more trainings available, more education available, more normalization available. I think that would help a lot. The fear factor, I think, is what divides us the most. That's it.
And Link, I've been hearing a bunch of education, and I know you're the first one to bring this up, but I have to say I'm very impressed with your community outreach and what you've said. So what's mental health look like to you in your community where you're personally working boots on the ground in the trenches?
Um, well, I can start from personal experience. I was in a broken home. My mother was with a man who abused not only her, but all of us. And I understand that even to this day that I still have some issues. I wouldn't say I was the worst case ever, but it wasn't fair. It wasn't fun. And I've talked to other people, and when these people turn 18, like, okay, you're an adult survivor. Okay, live your life. And some of these people have a tough time coping with that, and they vice. Vicing could be through drugs, alcohol, sex addictions, eating. And so we need to really start education and outreach. Just like, you know what? Even though you're not a child anymore, you're still hurting from these. And here we see on this far side these fires of addiction, but we never really hit that root cause. And again, with Oregon being number 51 out of all the United States for mental health, it's just like we have a huge elephant in the room and we're just not really going for it. We're not really hitting it. And I think also part of when we talked about the education and the anti-bullying, like at certain intervals in education, like say second, fourth, like sixth, have these, kind of like a week program about bullying, and it hit it at their mentality, like what a second grader would understand, what a fourth grader, but be kind of consistent and institute that into our education. And if people say, well, why should we do that? Then just pull out a list of numbers. So many kids commit suicide, so many addictions, so many of these issues. Now, the butterfly effect, we can't totally calculate how much human suffering, much less physical costs, but there is something there that can be done. And so to say, when those people say, well, why should I do that? Well, here's a lot of things that could be helped by that. So if I had my magic wand, would be to, at certain intervals throughout the education system in Oregon, have kind of anti-bullying, but mix it with a culture of sensitivity, of understanding, say just because, you're black and they're white doesn't mean that you don't taste like chicken, Juliana, or, or, we're all still the same, it's still the same. And so I think instituting cultural sensitivity with anti-bullying and diversity training. And of course, these kids, they're going to take this home and they're going to talk about it with their parents. And so again, this might be the butterfly effect into the rest of the community as it disseminates. The message might weaken a bit, but we have a strong root that when they do grow up and become part of the society, that they will be able to carry that with them. Maybe send workbooks home and say, go home, here's a little worksheet, just like maybe 1 or 2 pages. Fill this out with your family. And so it really gets the family involved to talk with them about it and maybe help kind of further it with the family. Like, someone might rethink that thought about how they used to think about different cultures or people who are different from them. So, I mean, there's just some ideas that I'm throwing out there.
Exactly. And well, then I just want to have an open discussion about my next conversation. Chime in, everybody, no organization. Come on, let's have a conversation here. And I'm as a firefighter, the big thing to me is nipping things in the bud before they grow, while they're still tiny, while they're sparks. And a lot of what I've been hearing is definitely reaching the youth, reaching, educating, and, getting them out the doors. So this conversation is me being a youth, but you were speaking to another high school student. What would you suggest them to do? Organize, flee? What professionals could they talk to? Open floor.
What
I think it's
what touch points might be for a kid in that situation? Pardon me.
Yeah.
Some ideas in that sense of who they might call, and do kids have access to a phone to call someone? Is something that we have to consider as well. How would they make that contact with someone outside of their own family? Especially in if I can use the term, the tribal situation that we find our society to be in right now. And I know I mentioned I grew up in a situation like that, but because of my family's beliefs, we didn't reach out into other communities because we thought we were the best way to be, and we had to protect ourselves from all those bad people. And I don't think that my family was the only one that thinks that way. I think there's a lot of that that goes on now and today. And how do we get across those borders and break those barriers down so that we can see each other? If that makes any sense. Something we have to look at.
I think there's some great research. Like recently, went through an Arctic training, and they basically focus on the racism in our workplace, everywhere, at home, and make you really think pretty deep. And I was like, it was Portland-based organization, and most of the people in the room were in Portland, and they were asking about that. And it was funny because the leader had talked about going through Idaho, and she happened to identify as a Black person, and how scared she felt being in Idaho. And I was like, well, I was like, this would be a great program, but we need to take it out of Portland. We need to take it to rural Oregon to really educate our communities. And I think I love the idea of the youth. I think we need to teach the youth that their voice could be there. But when she was asking that question, I said, well, I'm kind of from greater Idaho, down here in the South, and joking that we were becoming part of Idaho. But it was like, that is our area. And, it's like, you don't have to go to Idaho to be scared. You can come to it. It challenged me when a couple of people I worked with at Kmart, they left here after 6 months because they were Black. And that is our community. And that represents, like it or not, it represents each of us. Even though we don't feel those things, that is our community, that somebody left here because they felt that uncomfortable. But I think that if we could get the youth to be the voice of like, we want this education. We don't want books taken out of our school. We want things brought in. You know, I put the pause speaker program as I think, you know, we have a program through HIV Alliance where somebody long-term living with HIV goes into the school and tells their story. But we could expand that to so many different levels of people going into the school and telling their stories, making it real so that a kid can understand like the bullying aspect, somebody that was bullied as a youth, telling that story of the feelings and the, you know, that has grown from it. You know, because you do have to go through a lot of growth to get over that, but some people do get over that. You know, some people turn to drugs and alcohol, and, you know, that is challenging. But if we could get those speakers into the school that identify each one of those parts, I think would be really neat. But I think our youth have to have the voice to say, you know, when the advocacy starts against that, they need to stand up and say, no, dad, grandma, aunt, uncle, whoever they're living with, say, I want this. We need this. You know, we need to know about different populations. So I think respecting those voices of our youth and wanting this education, you know, and maybe that will change the outcomes of some of the starting, you know, I see the library thing in there. You know, we have some adults deciding what kids should read. You know, the kids need to be the voice and we need to listen to their voices. And, you know, really prevention is always the least funded of each and everything of this, and you can prevent a lot of these issues that we've discussed here, you know. And my alcoholism, I've been recovering for 20 years. I really strongly identify that my alcoholism started because of my being gay and hiding for, you know, most of my life until I was 32 years old. You know, I drowned my sorrows and hid myself with alcohol. You know, and I know that that is a common trait for youth that are at risk, that, you know, they turn to something to, you know, dull the pain. And that's what I did. So I think, you know, prevention is the least funded. So you're asking for, you know, so we really do need to fund prevention, and you can prevent a lot of the catastrophic effects in the future. But that is usually the least funded amount. I know I went way far there, but, you know, those things that, you know, I touch on those because they are dear to my heart, because I know that I don't want some other person's story to be my story, that they had to struggle with alcohol addiction, meth addiction, heroin, because they're trying to hide their pain, you know. And if you don't have the counseling, if you don't have those resources, and I know that they're not there, they don't know how. The teachers in the schools in Douglas County do not know what to do. And they got Juliana, you know, they had her. Now, you know, she'd have peace at home, but, you know, working with all of you, I mean, that's why I reached out to you when Kevin and Betsy asked me, is like, you all touch my heart in some way or another, doing things in Douglas County to benefit, or in Curry County, Brett, you know, and, you know, you help me make an impact. And those are important things. So, you know, we got some powerful people in our community, and we're just a few of them, because there's amazing people out there that do amazing things. We just have to figure out some solutions and get through, you know, overcome some of the things that are happening across our country right now, and be the voice of reason, I guess, you know, because our youth are who are suffering.
And maybe this is me just putting a puzzle piece, Brett, and a puzzle piece you gave me together, Dane, but is maybe even giving our students the trust of letting them go and seek counseling without the overbearing supervision of their mentors or parents or things like that. Because when sometimes it's more difficult to talk to your parent, your grandma, about these types of things than it is your your counselor.
Yeah, I wanted to say too, a lot of our youth are leaving the state for economic opportunities outside. And so if they leave our 97% white straight community and go out in to a more diverse community, and say their boss is a person of another color, if they have no exposure and no knowledge of other cultures or other ways of being, how are they going to work with that boss? How long will it be before they insult that person that they have to work with on a daily basis if they don't know anything about it? I think it's for their own economic gain. I mean, plain and simple, for their own economic opportunities as well as their safety, you know? And I just don't think it's really fair to our kids to set them up for failure should they, God forbid, leave Douglas County.
Amen.
Can I throw something in there that that we talked a little bit about, and Juliana brought up the issue of housing, and I think that impacts not just LGBTQ youth, I mean, maybe even a little bit more because of the stigma that's there, but all across the board, we have youth that we're educating, and we're trying to create them a place where they can flourish and become adults and productive people in our society. But how are we going to retain them in our counties and in our locales if they don't have a place to live? And it's something I'm struggling with every day when I talk to people of what are you going to do about housing? Because it really is top of mind and top of list for me, something to look at doing that. So any ideas that anybody has, and I brought up an analogy today that when somebody takes a rough and crusty diamond, they just dig up out of a mine, it has to be cut. And each of those cuts are known as a facet. And the more facets that you put on a diamond, the more brilliant it becomes. And I think we're going to have to take on a lot more facets in our, specifically with housing, different ways of creating housing in our counties and in our state to accommodate all these different needs. And that will create a very brilliant base for people to have the safety and the wherewithal to know they've got a home that they can depend on and branch out into other things in other ways. I think that also may help to take away some of this tribal and some of the hatred feeling that somebody else is getting something that I should get. That why do they have that and I don't? So housing, I think, is something we really have to look at overall. And I keep bringing that up back up to the top of the list. We've somehow got to really address that and make a dent. I mean, we've addressed it a lot, not just here, but just in general, we address housing a lot, but I don't see big things happening with it. I'm frustrated with it.
I got to work quite a bit with Habitat for Humanity. I wish they had more money. I wish they could build more houses. We did kind of a cool thing with some of our older homeless youth. I worked with Habitat for Humanity. We applied for a grant and we got it. What we put together was a summer opportunity for the kids to learn survival skills, real basic survival skills. So we did a full week of how to survive in the wilderness, how to get 3 ways to get water, 3 ways to make fire, 3 ways to get food, 50 different edible plants out in the woods. We did a lot of, I thought, really neat training. The kids loved it. And they got a lot of the tools that they would need to procure water, to procure food, everything like that. And then we did urban survival the second week, and they learned how to survive in the city. Also, if, society went away, how would you survive in the city? How would you find something to eat? How would you navigate, in the city? And the kids felt like it really improved their chances of survival. They really felt the hit hard during COVID while they were homeless. They felt that they were hit harder than maybe some other populations. So it was really meaningful for them. But yeah, I wish there was a way that we could, I really think that many experiencing homeless would love to contribute to building more housing. Some of them, maybe they physically can't do, the roof job or something like that, but they could sure do the publicity piece, or they could, I'm sure there's something they could do. And for the youth, a chance to gain some skills, once they have a home, how to maintain it. Learning those things like, how to work with concrete, how to do plumbing and this kind of stuff. I think it really piques their interest in how to be a homeowner. If you've never done it, how can you know?
And honestly, going back to education a little bit, touching both on homelessness and valuable things to we can learn out there is, I mean, in my health and safety class and in my classes, I wish I was taught to properly balance a checkbook. I wish there was more actual while utilitarian things taught to me in high school, sewing, how to properly set bait traps or things like this. You know, fun things that are also that could help you with a leg up in the future. Because it doesn't have, I loved FFA when I got to work with those animals, and my favorite thing was making the boutonnieres with the flowers. I'm a flower child. So,
Yeah,
Well, I know apprenticeships are something that most of our community colleges are working together with a lot of the unions in Oregon, attempting to put apprenticeships in the community colleges where youth coming out of high school can start learning a trade without having to go through 4 years of college to get a job, when you could be learning that skill in
and
community
I hate
college.
I hate to break you off there, Brett, but something really important here in Douglas County, especially I think it's here in my district, is Brett brought up a super important issue. I think we should all talk about that. There's a community here in Douglas County where 1 in 5 youths are unhoused. Do you know a little bit more? Can you elevate us about that, Dane?
Yeah, it's Glendale, Oregon, and that is my understanding. 1 in 5 youth is unhoused, which is 20% of the population, and that's just, you know, the challenge there is our county has nothing. There's not a lot of resources for unhoused youth. Maslow project is down in Grants Pass. It's the closest facility that will house youth. So if you're unhoused and a youth in Douglas County, you really don't have very good resources. I know that Mark that ran P-Flag is actually opening a new establishment, Tasha's House, which will be like a drop-in center for LGBTQ youth. And then they'll also be working on an angle. I think they're working with Peace at Home on trying to coordinate some safe housing for youth. But I mean, I think that's a huge challenge. And that's just like, I was talking to somebody Brett knows in Curry, and I believe when they did the point in time count in Brookings High School, 26 youth were unhoused. And that's huge, man. It's just like, and to me, we all know that a larger population of those unhoused youth are probably what we've been talking about tonight, you know, and they have, you know, because of their identity, they have a greater risk. And, you know, so that is even more challenging. But I just think, you know, that is something that needs to be high on our radar for, you know, when the legislator does start looking at things, is like, you know, the focus on just on house as a whole, but every community really needs to have some resource close at hand for youth that are unhoused. And, you know, without that, you know, what is their future? You know, if that's what they're facing now, you're facing a lot of barriers.
I mean, personally, after last fire season, I was 20 years old. First fire season with $18,000 in my pocket, living in the woods in my tiny little Mazda. So I know, coming from Glide, where I'm from, whole families from there, is it gets worse out there. The winters get colder. We don't have resources, and when they do, they're a 30-hour drive away. And your car, you don't have gas. You can't trust your car. You've got to ask your family members, and sometimes the church resources are very far and few between. They're so spread out. Out in Glide, I think during the last census, there's actually about 3,500 people that live out in Glide. It's a small community with only about 2 actively involved churches. There's a lot of rural people who need those services, frankly.
And how can we expect our youth to be educated if they're having difficulties being fed and housed and they're constantly looking over their shoulder to see what threats coming at them. So somehow we need to level the playing field through some basic equity to get everybody on the same starting line. And then let's, let the kids be kids and learn what they want to learn. But somehow we have to figure out a way to get them housed and fed and safe. And I think all those things go together, because if you can get them in one place, we can keep them healthy. They definitely won't be out in the cold or in weather where if they're sick, they're not going to get better. So it just gives them a place where they can thrive. And this goes for adults as well. And older youth, over 18, you're technically an adult. You're not youth any longer. But I see kids coming out of high school, like trying to do things on their own. How do you move ahead? How do you become a productive adult and move forward in life? And I want to try and just find some ways. And as I mentioned, the different facets we have to look at, we may have to come up with some shelters where maybe youth could have a room overnight, at least a place to sleep off the street so that they're safe while they rest. Maybe there is space there for them to do homework or something of that sort. I'm just trying to think of ideas. Not everything is going to be a stick framed house, in a nice little cul-de-sac in a suburban neighborhood. There's going to have to be housing of all sorts of different levels. And I'm trying to think all sort of stuff. It may be a laundry trailer or a bunkhouse trailer that we pull into a town or an area that's there for, I don't know, a month or a couple of weeks to help stabilize some people and give them a place to be while they find work. So then
And
they can
maybe
move
if
on
you're a
beyond that.
registered student at a school, they could have, temporary shelters for maybe weeks at a time.
Some of
There's
those big parking lots that schools have, maybe we could pull in something like that. Pull in a
Uh,
trailer that's got bunks. That's sort of a
Link.
makeshift dormitory.
I see your hand is up, buddy. Link.
Yeah, I had a thought, and I actually thought this. I've thought about this for the last couple of years. Is maybe having satellite vocational training, computer-based training for people in these communities. Like, if the state could possibly find small little venues, have a couple computers there to where people could come and train, get those degrees or those associates or whatnot. That way they could get better jobs to get into better housing. So an overall community effect. So these computer-based trainings, like, you could find like an old laundromat that's not existed anymore and put like 8 computers and have these people register for classes through the state and get these computer-based training modules done to, again, because sometimes when it comes down to it's like, do you have the paper for this, job, and a lot of people are like, well, I have experience in this area, but I don't have that degree. And that's been a lot of people's issues. So hopefully you could, if you can raise the community up, these kids will come up with them, because dad has that better job now. We actually are getting better housing or into housing.
I think we have an extraordinary opportunity right now too, because of the recent fires. People found out when we lost 1,000 homes south of here, it only takes minutes to become homeless. It isn't just those people. Anybody can become homeless, and good people become homeless. So I do think that some lights came on as far as people's attitudes and people's thinking about who the homeless were. I think some minds were changed.
I've recently discovered, I've been told, these are things I've heard out in the community now, that someone who is couch surfs, so maybe living on a family member's sofa or living in a family member's house while they get settled somewhere else, people who live in RVs, by this person's standard, are considered homeless people. That is not my standard. If you got a roof over your head and a place to live, you're not homeless. So we're solving that problem one step at a time. So I think part of it is people's perception. One of the other things that was brought to my attention this week too is, and it's a term, I grew up in Southern California. I was used to having migrant workers there. The places I lived still were very, I don't want to call them rural, but they were agricultural, tomatoes and strawberries and those types of things within miles of where I grew up. And migrant workers would come in and do that work as necessary when the season came. that something I hadn't considered before, that our fishermen along the coast are technically, by definition, migrant workers, because they do move with the seasons. So I think we've got to approach how people perceive these different titles. And unfortunately, migrant workers tend to be looked at as somehow illegal immigrants or immigrants that shouldn't be here. So that might be something else for us to look at too, in some way to educate the public about these are necessary people. And I've been hearing discussion about all of the immigrants at the border waiting to pour into our nation. I think 5 million was the number that I had heard that have come to the border to come into the United States. And at the same time, I hear that we have 10 million unfilled jobs in the US. So that would only take care of half of our labor requirements. So I don't see why there's such a pushback of having people come here to our country to be involved in the American dream.
I mean, technically, as a wildland firefighter, I'm still an unskilled professional, even though I get trained to have people's lives in my control. Betsy, I see you have a question, our lovely moderator for tonight.
Yeah, actually, it's not a question as much as a comment. For one, when you talk about migrant labor, one of my son-in-law's father was a Mexican migrant laborer here in Douglas County. And so I have a granddaughter who, what you see is people, and I was in the 1990s, I was the literacy coordinator for Umpqua Community College, and I ran an English as a second language program that was a family-based English as a second language program. And what I saw back then is, I'm not sure how much has changed, and maybe people, have a better idea, is very much so. And we had a lot of Asian immigrants in our ESL program, and they tended not to be very integrated into the community, right? As a safety issue, and we would have discussions about various things there. And I'm sure it's a consideration, but before this program, I went and looked at some demographics from the census data, and not surprisingly, though, the Latinos are the ones who are the largest growing population from 2010 to 2021. There's actually over 2,000 actual numbers that have immigrated within that period of time, when there's only around 1,000 white people who have immigrated here, which I think is good. And I come from the LA area, and I actually worked for a while for a community center called the Centro de la Raza, and who we served was folks who were Latinos, and did a lot of immigration work back then. And so, I see, for one, the stark change in demographics to me was startling. I came from a community actually in LA and Long Beach that was predominantly not white, just that one area, the area. And so I found it very, and even over 30 years that I've been here, it's very odd to me to hear people who were born and raised here, who are my age, who say terms in reference to people of color or Black people that, and they're liberal, tend to be liberal, will say colored people, or will use terms like that. That is something that was out of my vernacular 30 years ago. And so, I wonder how much we've actually progressed. And the other thing I want to say about one of the other hats I've worn in my life, I did special education advocacy, as well as homeless student advocacy within the public school system here. And a lot of barriers exist. And this is where the state legislature can really ensure that we have better services to people. And a lot of in the special education arena, it was usually people with learning disabilities and mental health issues. And all of them came from low-income community, low-income households. And so the households demographics paid an issue regarding what that child's life will be. And they even have even more against them. And there's a lot of disabilities. I think that Link actually said something in reference to mental health issues. There's a big stigma. There's a lot of disability discrimination against it, but even physical, limitations. I would suggest somebody get in a wheelchair and come to downtown Roseburg and see where you get to go. Okay, don't get out of that wheelchair. Even after millions of dollars of infrastructure. So one of the things years ago, I took a class about disability, and it was actually, the book was from England, and it made the premise that society creates these barriers that make us less than, right? So our whole social structure always has barriers for people with disabilities, has institutional barriers for people of color, LGBTQ, you know, so it's really, you know, it's good to say the legislature and all these education pieces, but really we have to look at that systemic. Why do we need to compete with somebody of color because we're competing for crumbs? You know, there's an easy way to divide us based on race, you know, so it's, you know, oh, that person looks different. And that whole tribal concept that we talk about, and we know, you know, from a sociological perspective. So anyway, there's my 2 cents. Thank you. And thank you for coming in the discussion. You know, I think it's very important. And I do want to say one more thing. The Democratic Party, actually this last year, we actually did monthly online programs called community discussions that were attempted to be nonpartisan, because they were attempting to get to that core of, you know, what things. So we talked about issues like campaign finance reform, because there were 68% of the voters in Douglas County voted for campaign finance reform. So we knew that we could, you know, so this is what these discussions I think need to happen. And even as a person who is heavily involved in the Democratic Party locally, I still support the idea that we have to have these discussions on issues and topics of importance. And I think that's one of the important things about Kevin's campaign, is he's really tried to be able to focus on, you know, what are these topics, and maybe those topics that bind us, not divide us. So anyway, now I will shut up. Thank you for being here.
And maybe another diversity thing is classism here in Douglas County, because I know some of the bigger areas like Douglas County, Roseburg and Melrose are a little bit more affluent, but as soon as you cross the divide of 138 to Glide, there's a real big cutoff when you go to the houses behind, you know, the churches, and when you go to Coos, you know, all these different places, and they're not really equity the same. What?
No, and I would love to see us continue these community educations and try to grab more people, you know, into these discussions, because I think it is an important. I think we can raise awareness, you know, as a community, how to be a better community and how to grow. And so I would love to see us, you know, continue our community education like we've been doing, and you know, because I learned a lot this whole time. So thank you, Kevin, for putting these together, and Betsy, because I think they are very important. And so thank you, Juliana. Thank you, Link. And thank you, Brett, for coming tonight, too.
Thanks for having me.
I
I'm putting
can't
some
do
of
it
my
all the time.
personal info in the chat. So if any of you want to call me, I'll put my phone number in and my email address, so you can contact me that way if you have any ideas or need anything from me.
Juliana, Link, Dane, Brett, I want to thank you tonight, because I can't do it without every single one of you. To be frank, you're my on guard, and love you. Thank you for coming out tonight, and I hope you can be there next Sunday, which is going to be kind of just a more generalized conversation, and we can bring about a whole mesh. We're the coalition builders here, and let's build some coalitions that we can stand on and win some elections in. That's for sure.
Right? There's the important part. We'll make a bigger difference if we could have a seat at the table.
They can't turn us off when we're there. That's for sure. We got some loud mouths. Link,
No, and
Juliana,
I think
Dane. I was gonna excuse you, but you're good.
No, I was just going to say, to me, these discussions that we're having are not, they're nonpartisan discussions that are just so important. So appreciate you all being here. Thank you.
Can I toss in one quick point before we all go? And I thought about this when Betsy was speaking. Of all of the meet and greets and forums that I've done over the past few weeks, you know, dealing with my campaign, I've only one time had a group ask me what I would do as a state legislator to help improve diversity and equity and outreach in the communities. Of all of the places I've been, only one time was that question asked to there were 3 candidates on the panel at the time. And we were asked that question from this group, and it's the band and inclusivity group. So obviously inclusivity is something they're very interested in, but I didn't have any questions any place about that. And the other thing I found really surprising, I didn't have any questions or hear any discussion about any of the measures that are on the ballot, the state measures. So just things for you to keep in mind in the next couple of weeks while you're talking with friends and family. Make sure they're aware of what those issues are. You know, measure 111, 12, and 13 and 14. They're important things on the ballot. So I just wanted to bring that up before we go.
Amen. And anything else? Anybody? Well, I again thank you all for being here tonight and love you all. See you later. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, Kevin.
Be safe out there.